Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Transition. And I'm your host, Rashad McCants. And I'd like to start by saying thank you for joining me. This is a real journey, a real process, a real adventure. And so today we'll be talking about my own personal testimony, my own personal transition. And with these testimonies, these stories, this experience will allow you all to understand the process that not only it took me, but a lot of others through transition, transformation, and then eventually transcendence. And so to start, we really want to go through the key elements and factors of what it takes to transition. All of us have different elements. We have different industries, sectors. We all come from different backgrounds. We all have different passions, desires, but we all have to make the same transition, whether it be from life to death, from a bum to a billionaire, from man to God, from business to athletics to business, from being a mother to being an entrepreneur, to being a father, to being a police officer. There's always an adjustment and a transition and a process that goes along with these decisions. So today we'll talk about the identity that is needed during this process. And I'll be giving me some personal testimonies on what I had to do during my first transition. So I'd like to start by just talking about a few elements of identity and just talking about that process alone. There are many versions of yourself, and the one that tends to stick out is the old version of you. And this is the pre-transition, where you have to identify who you were. You have to identify who you are. And then eventually you have to identify who you want to be. And the version that you always come back to is always waiting for you, because we always revert backwards. We always go back in time to the past because we're comfortable with who we were. It's the only part of us that we can really identify with because we're so familiar with our memories and everything that's happened. It's so easy to access our memories, but it's also so easy to forget about the present. And so the old version of you is dying of age, decaying slowly. It's literally losing its steam. But the more we cling to the old version of ourselves, the less of an ability we have to transition into our transformation and then eventually into our transcendence. So we must identify the old version, the current version, and the new version. The first step of that process is understanding that the old version must die. This goes into the rebirth. This goes into the death of the ego, the death of the mind. The old version of you has a great responsibility to make room for the new you. It's almost a metamorphosis where you have to peel back those layers. You have to come out of your cocoon. You have to leave the old self behind. This is something that is very, very difficult, especially for athletes, entertainers, people who are so accustomed to doing things for convenience. It's hard to leave these things behind. It's hard to abandon the comfort zones, but it's a must. because we all have to transition at some point. But once the transition and the decision to transition has been made, you then have to transform into your new self. So the identity is always about awareness. Who are you? Who do you want to be? Who were you? There has to be an understanding of these elements and why they are so important. For me personally, I have to say that my transition was probably the most difficult thing that I've ever went through. Seeing that I'm well versed in a lot of different areas, considering music, sports, film, tech, education, a lot of different desires that I have within industries and sectors that cause a person to have to transition into these places, whether it be for the information's sake, the experience sake, or just the understanding of how it all works. So I'll give you an example of my personal transition from being a professional basketball player into a professional business entrepreneur. Very difficult, very difficult, because stereotypes are real. And this is why the identity is so important. Because once you understand who you are now, it can become very easy to know who you will be, who you want to be, who you're destined to be. So for me, retiring in 2018 from the big three allowed me to really hang up the sport after years and years and years of playing and trying and attempting to reach the highest plane at the highest level, and not having too much to fall back on within that industry. The transition ultimately happened within music, film, and technology. What does that look like? What does that transition look like for an athlete going into music? Let's talk about the stereotype of an athlete who is interested, has a desire in trying to become a better artist. He has no idea where to start. He has no information on equipment, writing, production, just interested. I just want to do it. Where do you start? Where do you go? Who do you ask? There's a transition that needs to happen. There's an understanding that needs to happen. And so for so many of us that are doing one thing and want to transition into another, we all have to understand that there's a process. There is a process. There is a formula. There is a method. And within that method, within that formula, within that process, you're going to need people along the way that know what they're doing. You're going to have to ask questions that you don't want the answers to. You're going to have to do a lot of work on your own. Soul searching. There's going to be trying times where you're going to want to quit because you're not getting the results you want. Personally, in the music industry, I've been doing it for 16 years. And for 16 years, I've been on my own, figuring it out step by step, starting with just writing. I can attest to my first encounter with a music industry exec. His name is Ninth Wonder. He's very prominent in the music industry, hip hop world. And he's from North Carolina. I ended up meeting him while I was in college. And I was so excited about music and wanting to really dabble into it on top of being a McDonald's All-American and a freshman at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Called him over to my apartment, and I wanted to spit my rhymes. And I was very much so into poetry at the time, so I knew how to form my sentences. I knew how to make things rhyme, and I knew how to write to a beat, but I didn't know anything about bars, cadences, 16s, eights, hooks, choruses, bridges. I had no idea about any of these things. So the first thing he said to me after I was spitting my rhymes is, all right, this is good. But you have to break it down into sections. Got to break it down into sections, and you got to put it into music form. And you got to understand, this is Ninth Wonder. He's working with Jay-Z on the Black album, one of my favorite artists. And he's breaking my heart, telling me, oh, this is not it. But keep working. Keep working. So two things could have happened. I could have took that advice and allowed it to crush me. And I would say, you know what, this is not for me. This is for rappers. I'm a basketball player. I'm gonna stick to what I do. I'm gonna stick to what I know. But that didn't happen. I took his advice. I started to dissect music more, research, really dig into the artists that I really liked, started really studying their music, listening to their cadences, how they flowed, the music they made, why it felt good. And I was able to distinguish how to do it. And my first time in a music studio, Rasheed Wallace's brother, Muhammad, allowed myself and a couple of friends of mine to come into his house. He had a studio in his house, and he allowed us to come in and lay some tracks down. And this was my first time. I think it's my sophomore year in college. And I was able to put down my verse, write my verse. I remember it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. We're watching NBA TV, and Dwayne Wade was playing. And I ended up writing everything right then and there and putting my verse in the booth on wax, on a track, on a CD. And it came out nice. And I think that was where I found another love for something else. And this thing allowed me to not depend on basketball solely and have another passion that could take me away from the game if I was ever down or depressed or frustrated. I could always go write music, record music, and feel so much better about it. And so that began transition number one, is just understanding that I had a place that was new that I can work at, similar to how basketball happened. When I found out that this was just easy, came easy to me. And if I wanted to make it to the next level, I just needed to work harder at what came easy. Same thing in music. What came easy was the words. Because I was a poet, it was easy to distinguish how to rhyme my words, coming up with topics, listening to the production. And these things transitioned me into understanding culture, understanding expression, And the whole basic premise behind music and musicianship is the expression. Everybody wants to express themselves. So whatever it is your transition is, it is an element of your expression. You have more to express. You have more to show. And you cannot be confined by the space of one industry, of one sport, of one job. We all have to understand we have a place in this world, and there is never just one place. We can be in all places at once. That's why we call it multitasking. And so, as your identity plays a huge part in understanding how to transition, whether it be in music, film, or what have you. For me personally, transitioning from basketball into music while still playing basketball allowed a whole different perspective of what it took to go from being good at one thing that everyone thinks you should solely focus on and trying to be good at another thing that you're new at. You're behind the ball immediately. There's a stereotype there. You're a basketball player. You can't rap. You can't talk and dribble and sing and rap at the same time. Not possible. And you definitely can't be good at it. So for me, that was a challenge to make that transition a reality, a possibility. I had to work for that. Long hours, many studio sessions, over 200 plus songs created. I had to be a connoisseur of production, finding out what my niche was, what my sound was, what my image was, what my message was. It was a whole nother process outside of basketball that took creativity and expression to a whole new level. So during those 16 years of me doing music, pursuing music, and perfecting music, still to this day, that transition has become harder and harder. Now, today we have basketball players, football players who make music. Some have been more successful than others, but there's still a stigma. There's still a stereotype. Yet it doesn't say that it's not possible. The transition is still available. Because once you transform, you can transcend. But you cannot transform until you transition. Transitioning is the scariest part because everyone's against it. Everyone's against it. Even you're against it. No one wants to go through that. It's scary. Jumping into the water or something new that you have no idea about, but you're just interested. So we have to understand the identity of who you are. The identity of who you are right now is going to allow you to let go of who you were in your past. You are no longer a basketball player. You're no longer a football player. You're no longer the janitor. You're no longer the mailman. You're no longer the nail technician. You're no longer the bartender. You have to transition into something new. Now, a lot of people go into their comfort zones, transitioning things that may be a little bit easier, but they hate it. We're not talking about any of those things. We're talking about what you love. Transition into what you love. That's the only way you can transform into who you need to be, who you want to be, the new you. The transformation is the powerful segment of the adventure. And then the transcendence is the celebration of that perseverance, of that patience, that time, that effort, that expression that you put into this transformation allows you to transcend regardless of your praise, regardless of the criticism. You have done it. And all it took was simple awareness of who you are, who you were, who you want to be. Think about that. Welcome to the transition. I'm Rashad McCants. Until next time.